In this lesson, you're going to learn how to write test cases that interact with our Express REST API. So our test cases will actually make requests to the various endpoints. Then we can write assertions to make sure they worked as expected. So if I want to write a test case that logs in successfully, I could expect I get a 200 back with an authentication token in the response. I could also write a test case that makes sure when the credentials are invalid, I don't get logged in. So we'll learn how to do that in a moment. Before we can get to that, we have to remember that our test cases, they're about to start loading in files in the source directory related to the Task Manager app. Now, currently, that would be a big problem because those files depend on certain environment variables existing, and they don't. We only load in that dev.env config file when we run the dev script in package.json. Currently, we're not loading in any configuration for the test script. So we need to make sure that we do supply a set of environment variables to Jest when it runs, so our test cases can actually start up the Task Manager server and make requests to it. Now to do that, what we're going to do is create a separate environment. We're going to create a new one called test. So we'll create the following file, test.env, to set up those environment variables. Now, what needs to get defined in here? Well, everything that's defined in dev.env. So port, SendGrid API key, the MongoDB URL, and our JWT secret. Now, you might be wondering, why create a new environment at all? Why not just load in dev.env for our test cases? And the answer has to do with the database, so the value for MongoDB URL. Currently, the dev environment is interacting with this database on our local MongoDB server. We don't want the test environment to also use that because the test environment, it's going to populate the database with seed data, so dummy data that the test cases can use to do things like test login, and it's going to run test cases over and over again, so it'll be wiping the database, setting up that seed data, and running a test case. And if it's doing that for our dev database, it's going to make it hard for us to actually use the API in Postman as we're setting up new routes. So all we're going to do is take the dev.env file, copy it over to test.env, and add onto the end of our MongoDB connection string, -test. So now our test environment is using one database on our local MongoDB server, and the dev environment is using another, making sure they're not interacting with each other's data, which is going to cause problems. Now all we need to do is make sure that when we run that test script, the config file is loaded. So we'll be adding env cmd to the test command, just like we did for the dev command up above. And the path to the env file .config/test.env. Perfect. So now we have a modified version of our test script that is going to load in the correct environment variables. And that means our test suite is now ready to actually start the process of starting up the Task Manager app and interacting with it. Now, before we get to that, there is one more thing we're going to configure related to Jest, and that's going to happen right here in package.json. What we're going to do is add a new root property in package.json. So right here, we can add it anywhere we like. I'll add it just below scripts, for example. And this one is going to be called Jest, and this is going to store our Jest configuration. It's an object itself, and we'll put a comma at the end. And right here, we can provide the various things we want to configure. Now, for our purposes, working with Node.js, the only thing we really need to set is what's called test environment. This is JSON, so make sure to put your property names and values in double quotes. Right here, that is test capital E environment. And the value for this one is node. Now, if you want to learn more about how you can configure Jest, the documentation is going to guide you through that. So over here in the sidebar, if we scroll down to API docs once again, we have configuring Jest. This talks about exactly what we just did, setting up a Jest property in your package.json file to configure it, although there are other ways, creating separate files, which you could also use. And on the right-hand sidebar, they have all of the different things you can configure, and there's a lot. Now, the only thing we need is test environment, which we already used, and if we pull that up by clicking it, we'll see the default value is JS DOM. This is a JavaScript environment similar to what you'd see in the browser. So by default, Jest is assuming you're testing browser-based JavaScript, though it also supports Node, as we can see down below. We set the value to Node to use a Node environment for our test cases instead. And this is definitely something we want to do, especially as we start to load in all of those Node scripts inside of the source directory. So now that we have this in place, Jest is all set up and it's ready to actually go ahead and start up our app and connect to it, making queries to the API from our test cases. That's what we'll do in the next lesson, so let's jump right in.